I'm about as real as they come.
All my beats tailored by Joe. House Digital.
Maserati, Rick in Detroit. Convertible bird in Miami. Graduated summa cum laude. Strip club made a tsunami. Carlton Hines with the ball game. Grateful Edmonds with the snowflakes. Craig Pettis in the M-Town. Sal Magluta with the boat game. Falcone with the cocaine. Like Freeway Ricky with the plug game. Like Monster Cody in South Central. Larry Davis from close range.
Silence of a normally quiet night, and the lives of two undercover cops were shattered by gunfire in a sting that went terribly wrong. The island was turned upside down as police officers from all over the city raced into neighborhoods from Stapleton to St. George in search of suspects responsible for killing two of their own.
This department and this city will not rest until those responsible for this barbaric act are found.
In the air and on the ground, the police left no stone unturned.
At approximately 8 o'clock this evening, two New York City police detectives were shot and killed during a gun-buy operation here on Staten Island.
According to Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly, two of New York's finest made a deal with 18-year-old Omar Green to buy a Tech-9 handgun. It was a deal that would cost the two police officers their lives.
They agreed to go forward with the deal. The two men in the lobby got into the back seat of the car with the undercover detectives, and over the cell phone, Omar directed them to drive.
From there, they drove through the streets of Tompkinsville in a black 2000 Nissan Maxima driven by one of the detectives. Tailing the Maxima were three unmarked police cars who were also listening in on the wireless microphones. It was at Victory Boulevard and Corson Avenue where things started to go wrong.
The detectives pulled the car to the curb. The backup detectives had to now regroup because the car had stopped.
One of the suspects stepped out of the Maxima to talk to Omar Green, who was in contact with the two suspects on a cell phone. When the suspect returned to the Maxima, the two detectives and the two suspects drove up Corson Avenue and turned onto Westervelt Avenue. It was then that the backup cars lost sight and contact with the Maxima. Fearing for safety of the two undercover cops, detectives in charge ordered a search of the neighborhood. Minutes later, police found the bodies of their two colleagues on St. Paul's Avenue and Hannah Place. Both were shot in the head. The two police officers were rushed by ambulance to St. Vincent's Hospital, where they were both pronounced dead.
And tonight, tragically, we grieve for these brave men, and we pray for their families.
The mayor is calling this a gruesome murder, and he vows that the suspects will be apprehended. At St. Vincent's Hospital in West Brighton, for the Staten Island News Center, I'm
Today's
Jonathan.
decision sent shockwaves through the families of Detectives Nemrin and Andrews.
Detective Mary Ann Andrews was too overcome by emotion to speak about today's decision to overturn Ronell Wilson's death sentence. 3 years ago, Wilson was convicted of murdering Andrews' husband and another undercover cop back in 2003. Detectives Rodney Andrews and James Namorin were involved in a sting operation on Staten Island when Wilson took them by surprise and shot them, execution style, in the back of the head. Wilson was found guilty of the murders, but today, a federal court ruled that Wilson will need to be resentenced because his constitutional rights were violated during his trial. The president of the Police Officers Union opposes the panel's decision. Patrick Lynch said, "This vile individual should not be spared because of a mere technicality. He is a cold-blooded killer who deserves the fate that he has brought on himself." But Mike Palladino, the president of the Detectives Union, said he was not optimistic Wilson would receive a second death sentence.
It's going to take a miracle to recreate a death sentence with a new jury panel.
Palladino spoke on behalf of a distraught Mary Ann Andrews, who did not prepare a statement for the press.
You bleed, and the wound heals, and the wound reopens, and the blood continues to flow.
Wilson received New York's first federal death sentence in more than 50 years. Now prosecutors must decide whether to continue seeking the death penalty. Palladino encourages them to appeal today's ruling, possibly all the way up to the Supreme Court. Sarah Grossbarth, Pix 11 News.
A female federal prison guard in court today charged with having an illegal affair with an inmate. That inmate, a convicted cop killer. She's now pregnant and she faces more than a dozen years behind bars. Eyewitness News reporter NJ Burkett was in court and joins us live from downtown Brooklyn with more. NJ?
Down a federal court downtown Brooklyn where Nancy Gonzalez has just been released on bond. This was the scene here about 15 minutes ago. I want to show you the videotape. Ms. Gonzalez leaving the federal courthouse amid a crush of reporters and photographers. A 29-year-old prison guard charged with having a series of sexual encounters with an inmate, and not just any inmate, the convicted killer of 2 New York City cops. Ronell Wilson was arrested in 2003 for murdering 2 New York City detectives in cold blood on Staten Island and is serving a life sentence in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, where Nancy Gonzalez worked the 4 to midnight shift. Prosecutors say the 2 had a series of sexual encounters, most of them in a vacant room next door to Wilson's prison cell. The alleged relationship went on for more than 4 months, and investigators believe she is now 8 months pregnant with Wilson's child. In a series of phone calls routinely monitored by jailhouse supervisors, Ms. Gonzalez is overheard saying, quote, "I took a chance because I was so vulnerable and wanted to be loved, and now I am carrying his child. Why not give him a child as far as giving him some kind of hope?" End quote. But Ronell Wilson's crime was so heinous, the U.S. Justice Department may seek the federal death penalty. He climbed into the back of an unmarked car and shot 2 undercover detectives, James Nemerin and Rodney Andrews, point blank in the head. In one of her phone calls, Nancy Gonzalez seemed to struggle with her conscience. "How am I going to explain this to this little boy? Mommy was in the military. Mommy was a CO. Mommy got wrapped up with a person who took lives. So how do you explain that?" End quote. Nancy Gonzalez said nothing as she left the courthouse. If she's convicted of all of this, she could face up to 15 years in federal prison. Her attorney, Anthony Rico, spoke to reporters just a few minutes ago and acknowledged that the charges are serious, but said it is not necessarily what it seems. Live tonight in downtown Brooklyn, NJ Burkett, Channel 7, Eyewitness News.
Yeah, we back. It's your boy Popalot. Mobb, ties. We on our way to NYC with it. Staten Island, Stapleton. Now, everybody from the city, y'all get in the comment box. Definitely, if you're from Staten Island, if you tapped in from Stapleton, we need you below. Now, today, we are going to be covering a guy by the name of Ronell Earl Wilson. Now, again, we're going to be covering Ronell Earl Wilson. He was born May 4th, 1982. Some people might know him as Rated R. We coined him Death Trap because he was on some whole shit for real. Now, what basically got him on Mobb Ties or got him across my desk was an incident that occurred in 2003. And that's going to be where 2 undercover officers were murdered in the process of a sting operation to purchase firearms from an alleged suspect. That sting operation went wrong, and the 2 officers would end up being killed. It was said that their bodies were searched, and as well as the car that they were driving was stolen. Now, 2 days later, authorities will go on to arrest Ronell Wilson. And that's just the beginning of the saga, because his trial would take place in November of 2006. Now, on December the 20th, 2006, he was found guilty of 2 capital murders as well as other related charges. And on January 30th, 2007, he was sentenced to death, which would make him the first prisoner sentenced to death by a federal jury in New York since the federal death penalty was reinstated, and that was going to be back in 1988. So with all the crimes that occurred from 1988 to the turn of the century, right around 2003. No one received the death penalty, but Ronell Wilson was right on line for that death penalty. Now, prosecutors would go on to say that he was part of a violent drug gang that operated in Stapleton. The government labeled them as the Stapleton Crew, but a lot of witnesses at trial denied using the name as the Stapleton Crew, which a lot of us know. They'll kind of just label you with what they want to give you the name of. Now, after being convicted for the murders and being sentenced to death, he actually had the conviction overturned on appeal. This was right around 2010, and the government filed for motions and petitions for a rehearing, and they were denied. Now, after his sentence was vacated, he was moved from Terre Haute, Indiana, which is one of the worst prisons in the world, and then he was moved to the Metropolitan Detention Center, or MDC, in Brooklyn. Now, while he was in MDC, he would go on to meet a correction officer by the name of Nancy Gonzalez that was working the 4 to midnight shift. And on the dates of July 15th, 2012 and March 22nd, 2013. Actually, he would have an illicit rendezvous with her on July 15th, 2012. She would go on to give birth to a baby by the name of Justice on March 22nd, 2013. Now, for her indiscretions, I seen that she was brought up and she was charged. She ended up receiving a year. I think she was facing up to 12 years in prison. Now, in the media, I saw that the baby Justice was removed from her by the government, and this was on charges of neglect. She would go on to say that she went to outings right after the baby was born with Ronell Wilson's family, and they would go on to get her intoxicated, and leading to her seeming to be a not fit mother, as well as going on to say that Ronell Wilson was not the first prisoner that she had sex with. She actually had sex with several co-workers, as well as another prisoner before Ronell Wilson, who was in the detention center on a drug beef. Now, and that was going to be in 2011. Now, with all of those allegations, that forced a federal investigation into MDC, where the government went in there and seen pretty much what was going on. How would a prisoner have access to a correction officer in that way in a federal penitentiary? Now, in July of 2013, Ronell Wilson was again sentenced to death for the 2003 murders, reinstating the previous death sentence that was thrown out in 2010. And it wouldn't be until 3 years later, on March 15th, where the judge residing over the matter would deem Ronell Wilson as mentally handicapped, making him ineligible for the death penalty under the 8th Amendment. Now, prosecutors would go on to announce that they would not seek to appeal that ruling, which would end up with Ronell Wilson serving life without the possibility of parole in USP Florence, which is another one of the most notorious jails. But I also seen that he was moved and transferred to USP Cannon in Pennsylvania in July of 2020. So this case is just filled with it's like almost read out like a movie script. But the thing that stood out to me most that I didn't mention was during his hearing at one of his trials, he wanted to bring in the documentary Illmatic that Nas released and play that to the jury in hopes that they could see, I guess, his aspirations or see what he wanted to be. But that was denied by federal prosecutors, citing the relevancy of the fact, stating that there's no determining factor saying that Ronell Wilson knew Nas. They brought up ill will in the article. It was just wow. This story is just next level. Y'all make sure y'all follow me on Instagram, on Twitter, POP_A_LOT. Y'all get in the comment box below. Let me know who we need to cover. Shout out to the subscriber that gave me this story. Anybody that y'all got that we need to cover that we missing, y'all make sure y'all tapping below. Get at me on IG, on Twitter, under the pictures, direct message, however y'all want to handle the situation. Y'all hit the bell below to subscribe for when this trill shit is dropping. Y'all know what it is. The Mobb. Mobb. Ties.